Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are unpacking a document that honestly, quietly holds the modern world together. We're talking about ISO/IEC 17025-2017. And more specifically, we're going to zero in on the concept of scope. We'll look at the massive global implications of this standard, and then we're going to drill right down into the granular details of how a lab actually defines its own operational scope. It's an absolutely fascinating framework once you realize how it applies to our everyday lives.
To really grasp why scope matters, we have to anchor the concept in reality. Think about it. Every time you jump into a brand new car and just trust that the brakes are going to hold, the electronics won't short out, and the safety glass will do its job, you are literally relying on the scope of this exact standard. The components of that car, they were tested in labs that had to definitively prove their competence to perform those specific tests.
And you know, the stakes go even higher than that. From massive global manufacturing lines to firefighters running into burning buildings with breathing apparatuses and heat sensors, accurate testing and calibration are absolutely crucial. It's what keeps our world safe, measured, and reliable. Without a standardized scope defining exactly what a lab is competent to do, that foundational trust, it just falls apart. To give you a sense of just how wide-reaching this is, let's look at a direct quote from Section 1 of the standard. It states that it's applicable to all organizations performing laboratory activities, regardless of the number of personnel. So, whether we're talking about a massive multinational testing facility or a tiny two-person calibration shop, this standard's expansive, universal scope applies to all of them. Here's the agenda for our explainer today. First up, the standard's universal scope. Second, defining a lab's boundaries. Third, the operational processes within that scope. And finally, managing laboratory competence. Let's get into it.
Section 1. The standard's universal scope. Let's start by unpacking some of the core vocabulary here, just to make sure we're all on the exact same page. First up, what actually is a laboratory under this standard? Well, the document defines it explicitly as a body that performs testing, calibration, or sampling associated with subsequent testing or calibration. Basically, if a facility is doing any of those three things, they are squarely within the scope of this standard. No way around it. Next is a phrase you're going to see a lot in the standard: decision rule. This is a rule that describes how measurement uncertainty is accounted for when stating conformity with a specified requirement. Let's demystify that jargon a bit. In the real world, right, no measurement is perfectly exact. There is always a tiny bit of uncertainty. The decision rule is essentially the lab's predefined math for saying, hey, even with this slight margin of error, we can confidently state this item passes the test. It's good to keep this in mind for when we talk about validating results later on.
Moving right along to Section 2, defining a lab's boundaries. Let's see how this goes from a massive global standard down into a specific lab's day-to-day operational boundaries. Because as you'll see, a lab can't just say they are accredited for everything.
According to Section 5.3, a laboratory must define and document the range of its laboratory activities. I actually like to think of this as the lab's passport. A lab can only claim conformity for tests and calibrations that are officially stamped within this defined passport. This documented range, that is the literal definition of a lab's scope. If an activity isn't in their passport, they absolutely cannot claim ISO 17025 conformity for it.
And this brilliantly illustrates the flexibility but also the rigor of the standard. Because whether these activities are happening inside a permanent, climate-controlled warehouse, at a temporary mobile pop-up, or deep out in a muddy field taking environmental samples, the laboratory activities have to meet the exact same requirements. Being in a different physical location doesn't give you a free pass to step outside the bounds of your accredited scope.
Section 3, processes within the scope. Now that we have those boundaries firmly set, how does the day-to-day actually work? The standard provides a really helpful schematic that maps out the operational funnel of a laboratory. It's basically a journey. It kicks off with the review of requests and contracts, making sure the lab actually has the capability to do what the customer wants. Then comes the careful selection and verification of the right testing or calibration methods. Step 3 is the actual execution of the test. And finally, reporting the results. Every single test item has to trace this exact, highly controlled path.
But here's the catch. You can't just pick a method once and forget about it. Under Section 7.2, to stay valid within their scope, a lab has to rigorously maintain all their methods, procedures, and supporting documentation, keeping them strictly up to date. If a global testing method evolves, the lab has to evolve right alongside it and verify they can still perform it properly.
So the real takeaway here is that a lab cannot just assume its results are correct. They have to actively and continuously monitor the validity of their results. Section 7.7 outlines exactly how they do this. Things like using certified reference materials, running functional checks on their equipment, doing intermediate checks, performing replicate tests, and retesting retained items. They do all of this to spot trends and stop errors long before a flawed product ever reaches the market.
Finally, Section 4. Managing laboratory competence. Let's look at the overarching management systems that keep this entire scope secure, compliant, and continuously improving.
The standard actually gives labs a bit of flexibility in how they structure their management system, offering an option A and an option B. Option A lists the minimum requirements directly within the standard, which essentially incorporates key principles from ISO 9000, while meanwhile, option B lets a lab establish a system in full accordance with ISO 9000. But the key thing to remember here is that the standard explicitly states both options achieve the exact same performance result. Because the goal here isn't just more red tape. The goal is consistent, technically valid results.
A major piece of this management puzzle is Section 8.5, Actions to Address Risks and Opportunities. The standard dictates that any actions taken against risks must be proportional to their potential impact on the validity of the lab's results. But it's not all defensive. By properly recognizing and addressing opportunities, a lab can actually safely expand its defined scope, taking on brand new technologies or meeting new customer needs.
Now let's talk about metrological traceability. It represents exactly what a lab's calibration chain has to look like. Traceability requires a documented, unbroken chain of calibrations, with evaluated measurement uncertainty at every single step. This chain links a lab's specific result all the way back to national or international standards. It literally connects a tiny local lab's scope directly to the global scientific consensus. Pretty amazing, right?
Which brings us to our final thought. I want you to consider everything we've talked about today. The precision, the rigorous methods, those unbroken chains of traceability. If a laboratory decides to just operate outside of its defined, documented scope, outside of its passport, can we really trust the result? This standard proves that the strict definition of scope is the absolute bedrock of global trust. It is the very reason we can confidently rely on the products, services, and safety measures we interact with every single day. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I hope this leaves you with a profound appreciation for the massive impact of standardized testing.